Dennis Hardy.
And so, Dennis Hardy, where do your Piermont memories begin?
Oh, boy, that's a really good question. I grew up in Piermont. I've lived in Piermont my entire life, 64 years. And, recently my financial advisor said, "Where are you going to move to retire?" And I said, "What do you mean, where am I going to move? I'm staying in Piermont. I'm not leaving. We love Piermont in the Hudson Valley." So my memories start at 573 Piermont Avenue, where I grew up, which is just north of the fire department on the riverside, just right a few doors from the Basque restaurant. Um, and that's where I grew up. And A lot of fond memories growing up in Piermont. I remember when we were kids, some of the playgrounds were the cowboy fields up behind the Tappan Zee Elementary School and the paper factory. The paper factory, Robert Gere Company and Continental Can Company were a wonderful source of, playground for us. Of course, not for the workers because they would chase us out all the time. We'd be in the stockhouse, we'd go under the underground tunnels in the old bomb shelter in the big building. And so we enjoyed, and then occasionally, we would, with the old stockhouse, which was huge. So when we were like maybe 12, 14 years old, what we would do is we would take one of the forklifts and we would move the paper bales and hide the forklift and put the bales behind it so they couldn't find the forklift. And, so this is one of the things we did. And so the paper factory was a big source of enjoyment for all of us. I grew up with the Goswick family, the Holmes family, the DeMeo family, De Lorenzo family, Sorientos, and Piermont was a wonderful playground. Now, my father, he used to be a boiler technician in the paper factory. And, he knew that we would sneak into the paper factory and he'd say, if you go in there and you play and, just make sure when you get out of the stockhouse, you shake your pants because there's a lot of roaches in the stockhouse and I don't want you to bring them home. So, true story. So the other source of, enjoyment for playing was Tolman Park and the 1,000-acre salt marsh down by Tolman Park. And when we were young kids, a lot of us used to trap muskrats and raccoons in the marsh. And at the end of the season, we would sell all of our skins to a buyer in Closter, New Jersey, who used to come up every year at the end of the season and buy our pelts. Not a lot of people know that, but my father taught me how to trap muskrats and raccoons. And I remember my mother, because when you trap and you catch your muskrats, a lot of times, you'd come home and you'd hang them so they would thaw out so you could skin them later on that night. But I would hang them in the basement next to the dryer. And my mother she'd always, yell at me, "You and them damn muskrats." And we would skin them and hang the pelts during the winter, and then they would be sold later on. And there were a lot of muskrats down in the marsh. And so at the end of the season, we had money to buy baseball mitts, baseball bats. And when we were young kids, 13, 14, 15 years old, having $150 or $200 at the end of the season was really a lot of fun for us. And we also used to hunt down the pier, because when we grew up, the pier was not open to the public. Okay, that was closed and that was owned by the paper factory. But we used to walk down there and we used to duck hunt down the pier and by the duck pond on the north side of the pier. Or by the mouth of the creek. We used to duck hunt there. And so that was a lot of fun. And it's interesting because when we used to hunt, I used to walk down the street, with my shotgun. Yeah, you try that today, you'll get arrested for sure. But we used to do that, and we used to go down in the marsh and hunt and trap, um, and it was a lot of fun. And the Cowboy Fields, like I mentioned, are right behind the Tappan Zee Elementary School, and they're still undeveloped. And so we would go up there, we would camp out up there, and our parents would allow us when we were 12, 14 years old. We said, we're going to camp up at the Cowboy Fields. And, this was pre-cell phone. No one had cell phones. And yeah, they let us go up and we'd build a little campfire and we'd sleep out and have a good time. And so, yeah, that was one source of having good entertainment. And then when we got a little older, because we lived on the river, many of us had boats. And I remember buying my first boat, which was a used boat from my next door neighbor, Barry Pagnosi. And I fixed it up, I painted it, and I needed an engine. And I went down to Bill Herget, or Bernard Herget, Bill Herget's father. He owned the mobile station, which is almost right across from the firehouse. So it was a service station, but he also sold Johnson outboard motors. And he had a lot of motors there. And I bought a motor, a 25 horsepower from him for $50. And I had to rebuild it. And I rebuilt it and I put it on the boat. And so I had my boat, my first boat. And we loved, when we were on the river, many of us, Terry Holmes had a boat, Billy Goswick had a boat, I had a boat, and we'd be out on the river. And we never ventured very far, not too much further than the TZ Bridge. And, we'd go south toward the GW Bridge, but we mostly hung around Piermont. And so that was a lot of fun, having your own boat. And my father owned a commercial fishing business. He also worked in the Robert Gere Company. He worked as a boiler technician before he was a police officer for Piermont, and then he went on to be a Clarkstown police officer until his retirement. But so we owned a commercial fishing business, and we were right on the water, and we fished for shad and striped bass. And so right now you can see outside the forsythia are blooming, and the forsythia is a sign. The old folklore, the Indians would know that once the forsythia is running, the shad and striped bass are running up the river. And I know they're running up the river right now, although there's no more commercial fishing allowed in the Hudson. We fished for, striped bass and shad for many, many years. In 1975, the state Department of Environmental Conservation banned the commercial sale of striped bass due to PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl contamination. And so that was the beginning of the end of the commercial fishing in the state of New York. So we fished for striped bass and shad for many years. We made more money on striped bass. And so once they banned striped bass, we tried to make a living catching just shad, but I finally had to end the business in 1993. But I have many, many fond memories of fishing on the Hudson River, putting the first nets out of the season, and a lot of fun working on a commercial fishing boat in the Hudson River. Now, we did that part-time because the shad and striped bass only run for generally a little more than 2 months, March, April, and part of May, and then it's over with. So we all had full-time jobs, and during the shad run, we would take our vacation. So I think for 25 years, I took my 2 or 3 weeks vacation fishing on the Hudson every year. And why did I do it? Because usually I made pretty good money. So I wasn't really concerned about my vacation. And it was a lot of fun fishing on the Hudson River. And, we would catch 5, 6, 7, 8,000 pounds. Our best day was 11,800 pounds of shad in one day. And, people are amazed. And I do have, thankfully, in 1989, I had a semi-professional photographer come out for 3 weeks and chronicled and took all photos of the commercial fishing business. And I have it on slides. So occasionally I do a slide presentation on commercial fishing. And I've done it for the Historical Society. I've done it Dobbs Ferry Library, Lions Clubs. And so it's quite interesting. In 1974, when we were fishing in, for shad, and we were up by the Tappan Zee Bridge, Donnie Piesco and myself, we caught a large fish. We weren't sure what it was. We finally pulled it in, but it was a 7 feet, 10 inch, 210 pound sturgeon. And it's actually hanging in Cornetta's restaurant right now. You can't say that, no, Dennis, you're lying, that's not true. It's hanging in Cornetta's restaurant, so you can see it. And the interesting thing, the Museum of Natural History wanted the fish, and they came to our house and they said to my father, we'd like the fish for the museum. And my father said, that's nice. And he said, but, I want to make sure that, you put a plaque and you have Dennis and Donnie's name that they caught the fish. And they said, we don't do plaques. And he said, well, you don't get the fish. So the Piermont Rotary said, I'll tell you what, they told my father, we'll make a deal. We'll pay to have it mounted with the understanding that it stays in Piermont. My father said, you got a deal. And so that's where the sturgeon is now. It's in Cornetta's restaurant, and you can go see it. Yeah. The other thing, and during the crabbing season, we also commercially crabbed. And one year I caught a very rare species of remora. It's about a 2-foot long fish, and I caught it in a crab net. And at the time, a New York State biologist was in the boat with me. And so I donated it to the New York State Museum. And they sent me a letter, and they said the last known recorded time that species was caught in the Hudson was 1844. So it's up in the State Museum. And it's a species of remora. The remora they attach to like whales and sharks. And so it's quite interesting, and the State Museum in Albany has that. So we used to crab commercially in the Hudson for blue claw crab. And at the height of my crabbing season, we used to run up to 200 crab pots, commercial crab pots. So we did that. And so what are some of the other highlights? Oh, so one time there was a guy in Grandview who built a house, and he had a boat, and he kept coming down to our dock, and he said, I work for CBS. I'd like to come out with you one time. So we said, come on out. And then he said, I have someone that I work for that I'd like to come out on the boat. And so we said, sure, bring him. And he brought Dan Rather one time. And but we told Dan, suit up, put your gear on, you're going to work just like the rest of us. And he went out on the boat with us, and it was a lot of fun. And commercially fishing was a wonderful growing up experience with my father, and being out on the river in March, April, and May during the commercial fishing season. there's just something magical about being on the river. And when you pick your shad and striped bass net, you have to pick them twice a day, and you pick them at the top of the high tide. So you're out there, if you're out there at 4 o'clock this afternoon, you're going to be out there at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the tide advances almost an hour every day. So your schedule shifts according to the tide. And there's nothing like being out on the river at 4 in the morning and then having the sun rise. And the only boats that are out there are the commercial fishing boats or the commercial boats, tugboats and so forth coming up the river. It's just really, really nice. And so I have a lot of photographs of that. And if you want to see any, I'd be happy to share them. So that was, growing up and fishing on the river. So what else? I mean, there's so much to do in Piermont. It was a factory town back then. We had Continental Can Company and Robert Gere Company. And we were a factory town. And, growing up, one of the things that I like to point out is, when we'd, be out on the street 8:30, there were a lot of people on their porches, Fanny Sorrento, Rachel DeLorenzo, Mrs. Tallman, they'd be out on their porches. And, if it got to be 9 o'clock, they'd say, what are you doing outside? You better get home. 9 o'clock, you got to be home. If the police saw you after 9 o'clock, they'd say, get home. And so, that was the wonderful thing about growing up. Everyone was family and really, really community oriented. So I do remember when I got my license, I was 16 years old, and I was caught speeding and down on Verdun Avenue. And the local officer, Bobby Edwards, my father was a Clarkstown police officer at the time. And I said, Bobby, he said, where are you going? You're doing 61 miles an hour. And I said, I'm going to, Dairy Queen in Closter. And he said, give me your license. And I said, oh, just give me a ticket. He said, no, I'm not giving you a ticket. He said, when I get off at 4 o'clock, I'm coming up and I'm going to talk to your father. And I said, no, please don't do that. Well, he took my license. He came at 4 o'clock when he got off work. And my father yelled at me. He says, I was in the bedroom down. He says, come on upstairs. And he said, Officer Edwards is here. And he said, you were speeding. And I said, well, yeah, I was. And he had my father had my license in his hand. And he said, your driving is over. And he tore the license up. And the officer was standing there and he said, have a good day, Mr. Hardy. And he left. And so my father didn't allow me to drive for 3 months after that. And so that's the way you did it back then, yeah. And growing up in Piermont was just really, really wonderful. But then what happened, we grew up, and then in the late 70s, the paper factory was in decline. There was pollution, et cetera. And, where the paper factory was, there's we call it the mill ditch. It's on Ferry Road. And the joke was, you knew what kind of boxes they were running because the ink went out into the Hudson River where they dumped all the stuff. And so it was a polluter, and the health department and DEC really clamped down, and they had to shut down, and so they did. But it was a pivotal moment for Piermont because here we grew up in a paper factory town, and all we knew was Continental Can Company, Robert Gere Company. So what were we going to do? And there was a lot of tax ratables coming from the paper factory, but eventually it got torn down. And, then a developer came, and actually we had a number of developers who came before the village board and wanted to build condominiums. We had one developer wanted to build 800 to 1,000 condominiums, and we basically threw him out of the board meeting and said, that's not happening. But finally we did build, as you know, and Piermont Landing is here. Now, it was built over phases. The first phase went bankrupt, and it sat for 4 years. And then it started up again in 1993. Then the second and third phase were built in 97, 98, 99, and that's when I was mayor. And now I live in Piermont Landing. My fiance and I live in Piermont Landing. So I never thought when I was a youngster that I would be living in condominiums where the old paper factory was. So it's quite interesting. And so, that was a pivotal moment for Piermont, but I'm happy with the outcome. I'm not sure about other older Piermonters, but I think I love Piermont the way it is today, and it's kind of it's got a little bit of old, a little bit of new, and yeah, I really enjoy living here, and I have no plans to move out of Piermont. So yeah, that's growing up in Piermont. I went to TZ High School, and as you know, or maybe not, there was a TZ High School in Piermont. My mother and father both graduated from TZ High School, and my father, told me the story. There was very small class, so when he played football, he played offense and defense because they didn't have enough students to play both, offense and defense separately. And so they both graduated Tappan Zee High School. And so my father married my mother. And it's interesting because my father was Protestant and my mother was Catholic. And that was an issue back then. And so my father converted later on to Catholicism. And they were married for many, many years. My father passed away in 1982, very young, of a heart attack at 51. And that's when I took over the fishing business from my father. I abruptly was thrust into taking over the fishing business after he passed away. And so I did that. And then later on, the one thing I really need to point out, community service in my family was something both my father and my mother instilled with all of my brothers and sisters. My brother has been in the fire department for 30 something years. He was recently chief. My sister's in Piermont Fire Department. My other sister, Pat, is in the Sparkill Fire Department. I was a fireman for a while. I worked on the underwater rescue, and I also worked on the ambulance briefly. And I say briefly because we had one of my first really bad accidents. It was a head-on collision on 9W, and there wasn't a fatality, but there were compound fractures. It was a terrible accident, and I said, "That's it. This is not for me." And I said, no, I didn't do that. I stopped it. And so then I decided that I wanted to be involved politically. In 1995, I think we were, because the paper factory closed, there were lost ratables, and the mayor at the time had to impose a 20% tax increase on the village of Piermont, which was really substantial. So I went to a meeting and I said, Mayor Zahn, I said, this is really unconscionable, 20% tax increase. And he said, Mr. Hardy, he said, if you don't like it, you know the drill. He said, you could run for mayor. And I said, you know what, you're on. And so I ran that following year, and I lost. I lost by 63 votes. And then I ran 2 years later, and I won by only 21 votes. And I say this kiddingly, but it's really not joking. I had a cousin who didn't vote in that election, and I still haven't spoken to him. So, and that was over 20 years ago. So I won by 21 votes. And then 2 years later, I ran with both Republican and Democratic support, and it was very nice to run unopposed. So That was an interesting part of my life, being mayor, giving back. I'm certainly not involved politically anymore. I support candidates, and my hat's off to those who want to be in public service. But back then, when I was mayor, 97, there wasn't social media. Today with social media, it's a real difficult task to balance that and be in public office. So I don't do that. I support candidates, but I'm glad I'm not in it anymore. And so, yeah. So, and the one thing, the emergency services, I really, my hat's off to all of them who respond. You're laying in bed at 3 a.m. and the fire whistle goes off, and they respond. And we can't say enough for our first responders in the village. And so we support them. I support them. And but I currently I'm semi-retired. I do work full time, but I do volunteer for the Lions organization and the Paramount Civic Association, and help out with those organizations. And so that's it in a nutshell. I mean, there's probably more. Do you have any questions?
Sure. Well, it was a great nutshell. It was a very,
Yeah.
a very healthy nutshell. It was a wonderful storytelling. And so I guess maybe anything, what were some of the tougher issues you had to deal with when you were mayor?
Good question. During 1999, we had Tropical Storm Floyd, when we had over 12 inches of rain, dumped within 24 hours. And so the water came flowing down the mountain and caused a significant amount of damage. I know it's part of the job, but there were probably a half a dozen residents who sued me personally. But that goes with the territory, and there was nothing we could do to mitigate that. The village engineer said, this was a 500-year flood. There was no way you could have storm drains of 36 inches in diameter. There was nothing that you could have done. But that was a difficult time for the village. And what happened is the emergency services, our police department, with the fire department, highway department had to respond, and we spent a lot of money, but it took almost a year to get reimbursed from FEMA. So that hit us financially, but I wouldn't change our response. I did what I had to do to ensure the safety of village residents, and I responded that the way we did back then. I would do it today. What was the Paramount Landing was a big challenge because that was always on our agenda. At Paramount Landing was a source of a lot of discussion, countless meetings. Paramounters were very passionate about what was being built in Paramount Landing and how it was being built. So that took up an inordinate amount of our time, and yes, we had bicyclists complaints back then, as we do now. And I will say, I'm happy to say that during my administration, we passed the single file law. We followed Grandview. And, we had many groups, including bike groups, come to the village board. And I said, this is not a punitive measure. It's a safety measure. We want you to come to Paramount and be safe. We have very narrow roads, and it's not a punitive measure at all. And so that's the way we explained it. And so we still have the single file law in Paramount. It's not always adhered to, but that's not my problem. That's the police department's problem. So, when you're governing in a small village, you're on duty 24/7. it doesn't matter where you go. You can go to the funeral home, then you can go to the food store, you can be out on the street. People will pick your brain. They'll want to talk to you no matter where you are. And I'll just remember my daughter was young and we were out on the pier. We were, she had her little bicycle and a resident stopped me and wanted to, complain about something. And finally, my daughter, who I think was 12 years old, and she said, "Daddy, you're supposed to be with me." And so, she was making a point, and the resident finally took the cue. But when you're mayor, you're on duty 24/7, even though the position is considered part-time and it's paid part-time. I think back then the salary was $10,000 a year, but you don't do it for the salary. You do it for the love of your community, and that's why I did it. And before I was mayor, I was also chairman of the Housing Authority for the town of Orangetown, and I ran the Courtwood Village Senior Housing for the town for 4 years. Then I was a trustee before that. So I did, 10 good years in public service. And, I'm happy to have done it. It was very good experience, but I'm grateful for people who want to continue to do that. And the good thing is, if I have an issue that I want to bring to the village board, I go on their Zoom meeting and bring my issue, and then I'm off and I can do whatever I want for the rest of the evening and they can continue their meeting. So I'm happy to do it that way. And so it was a very interesting time, being mayor. And on a personal level, when I decided not to run for a third term, I kind of in a funny way, I worried. I said, how is the village going to survive, without me being in office? And I said, and I really worried that, I said, this is going to be a problem. And the truth is, about a year after I was out of office, you'd ask someone who was the mayor a year ago and they forgot your name, so, that's kind of, that'll bring you down to a level where you need to be. So the village survived, and, every mayor, including John Zahn, who was mayor before me and I ran against, including Ed Trainer, Chris Sanders, and now Bruce Tucker. Every mayor governs a bit differently, but all of us have the best interest in our heart for the village. And so we may do it a little differently, but it's the best interest of the village. So yeah. And the nice thing, I do, have a good relationship with the mayor. If I have an issue, I'll call him or I'll text him and let him know how I feel about a certain issue. And I'll do that. So, yeah. So no more politics for me. I'm happily engaged and I want to stay that way. And so I will not get involved in politics anymore. So.
Man. So a question about the commercial fish industry. And I think we would love to include several photographs of the shad and striped bass fishing, especially the ones that you said were taken when you had your season documented by the photographer. So if you could send a couple of your favorite images to us, and we'll have them spliced into or edited in, and also a picture of the prize catch at Cornetta's. I think that actually has to be here as well. But I have a question just of the logistics. So what do you do with 11.8 thousand pounds of fish? Like
almost 6 tons. That's a really good question. So the only place there is the famous Fulton Fish Market in New York City, which back then was down just at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge, down by the South Street Seaport. You had a couple other markets like the Boston market or the fish market in Pittsburgh. Those were too far to truck your fish. So all of our fish were sold in Fulton Fish Market in New York City. They're the only ones that can handle that kind of tonnage and move it on a daily basis. So we would, if I brought 8,000 pounds of fish at 11 o'clock that night, the market opens at 3. By 4 o'clock, they're gone. They're sold. They sell everything every day. And so we dealt with Fulton Fish Market, and it was quite interesting. My father handled all of that and really didn't let me get involved. And then he abruptly passed away. And then I had to get involved with Fulton Fish Market. And the best explanation that I can give for the folks at Fulton Fish Market are thieves. They're a bunch of thieves. I mean, it's difficult to deal with them. And, you know, the price they give you, they'll tell you one price and then they give you another price. Oh my God, they're so difficult to deal with, but they're the only game in town. And, you know, they'd say, oh, your fish, they look a little, the eyes are a little cloudy. I'm not going to give you 45 cents. I'm going to give you 35 cents. So what do? You have to sell them. And that's the other thing that's important to point out. So when you go to the fish store and you see fillet of sole or Dover sole or salmon, you see it $11.99 a pound. We averaged 30 to 50 cents a pound for the fish that we sold to Fulton Fish Market. Now, we didn't dress the fish, we didn't gut them. They were put in boxes, they were sorted between the females, the male, the roe shad, which is the female, and the male, and then they were iced up and then trucked into the city. And so, you know, you would start out in the beginning of the season, maybe 60 cents a pound. But then when you started to catch a lot, and other fishermen like Bob Gabrielson, who was our competition right up north, and I think, Bill, you know Bob Gabrielson. Did you know Bob?
Through JC Brotherhood.
Yeah. So Bob was a commercial fisherman, and even though he was our competition for a number of years, he also trucked our fish down the market until I bought a truck. So now striped bass, you would get a little more money, maybe 70, 80 cents a pound. But then when striped bass were banned in 1975 and we could no longer catch them, then we had to rely on just shad, and we really couldn't make a living. And like I said, I ended the, you know, fishing in 1993.
Tell about cleaning fish at the end of the dock.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, you know, during the shad season, you know, we lived right on the river, but we'd have a lot of customers come to our dock. And it would always, every time I'd sit down to have dinner, you know, my father would say, oh, there's somebody out on the dock, you got to go out. And so I'd get up and I'd go out and I'd sell them the fish, and then they'd ask me to clean it. And sometimes they would tip me, sometimes they wouldn't. And finally I said to my father, I said, I want to put a sign that it's 50 cents per fish for cleaning. And he said, go ahead, put your sign up. He said, that's not a problem. And so I would clean the fish. But I had one customer in Palisades, Andy Norman, and every time he would tip me with these crisp $2 bills, and I still have some of them, he would always pay me in $2 bills. I don't know why, but he loves shad. Shad is an acquired taste. I don't know if you've ever had roe shad. It's a delicacy. It's called the poor man's caviar, and the roe shad, the eggs of the roe shad are generally baked with bacon on top of it in foil, and it's a delicacy. I never liked it, but I sold it. You know, it's quite different. Look it up and you'll see. But we had a lot of customers who like to buy it. Usually Russian and Polish people would really like the roe shad, and striped bass. Striped bass is excellent. I don't know if you've ever had striped bass. It's a very good fish, and yeah, we would eat fish out of the Hudson, and I would still eat fish out of the Hudson today. I don't think Lori would. She would probably not, but I would still eat the fish. You know, there is an advisory. If you go down on the Piermont Pier today, there's many people fishing, and they're not just recreational fishing, they're fishing for food. And yeah, striped bass is a really, really good white fish, and it's excellent, you know. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
I just had a really quick question going back to, you said where you grew up on Piermont Ave. Is your house that you grew up in still there?
That's a good question, Vicky. No, it is not. It was torn down about 5 years ago, and the lot still is there. And yeah, no, the house is not there. Yeah. Oh, and another thing which is interesting, my mother and father bought the house in 1954. They bought it for $5,500. And she said their mortgage was $35 a month. And I tried to explain to my mother that it's different today. And she said, how is it different? We had a mortgage. And I said, well, Dad made $10,000 a year. You paid half of his salary. For me to buy a house in today's world, I pay 6 times my salary. So it was, she still didn't understand it, but God rest her soul. But it was different back then. Piermont was a mill town and property was cheap. And had I known back then, I did invest in a couple of properties, but we sold them fairly quickly. Had I known, and I kept, hold on to those properties, I'd be a little bit wealthy, but oh well, so yeah.
That's interesting.
One more question. You mentioned that the Forsythia sign was something that was passed down by the native people of this region. Or any other, as a fisherman, you're obviously confronting the world in a way very similar to the world that they had, because they would rely on the river for such a large amount of their life and their meaning and their rituals. So anything else, were any other traditions passed down as a fisherman from the Native Americans?
Well, yeah. So, and I like that question because yes. So the other thing, the Forsythia blooming is a sign, and the shad bush is another sign which blooms now, is the sign that the shad and the striped bass are running.
What about the poles?
Yeah. So the type of traditional fishing method in the Hudson River is gill nets. And you're allowed to use gill nets, and generally you set poles every 200 feet, and then you put a 200-foot gill net. And so you put a series of poles, and during the height of the season, we'd have about 4,000 feet of net. And so we had 3 boats with 9 men running around the clock. So you'd set the poles in the beginning of the season in March, and you jump the poles. I have pictures, and I'll give you a few of those pictures because you'll see what I mean. So you put these poles in, and the poles range anywhere from 30 feet to 50 feet because it goes with the depth of the water.
Where were the poles from?
Oh, so the poles, where did we get the poles? We got them up in the cemetery, up behind the cowboy fields. We'd cut the poles. Every couple years, we cut a few more poles. And then after the end of the season in June, because by June 15th, the poles, the DEC mandated that the poles had to be pulled out of the water. And then what we would do is we'd bed the poles down in the water for the season, and we'd get them out the following year. And so you'd put the poles in, and you'd put the bottom line, and the bottom line is what your net hooked onto. So your nets went in for 1 week, well, not quite 1 week. So they had to be out of the water Friday morning, 6 a.m., and you could put them back on Saturday evening, 6 p.m. So it was a 36-hour lift period, and the lift period was mandated by the DEC. So you had your nets off, This way here, it would allow the fish to move upriver to spawn. Okay, so it was what we call an escapement period. And so and they were pretty strict about having your nets off and not on. And I remember one weekend, the weather was bad. It was very windy. I decided not to take my nets off because it was just too rough. And, around 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon, my coworker and Eddie Goswick, he was looking with binoculars. He said, "Dennis, I think I see a DEC boat out on our nets." And sure enough, they confiscated all of my nets. And then I had to go to New Paltz, and I had to pay a fine of $500. And the sergeant, he said, "This is the escapement period. You have to have your nets." I said, "Yeah, but the weather was rough. It was hard to get out there." And he said, "Mr. Hardy," he said, "your father is Don Hardy." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "But he's been dead a long time." I said, "But he did the same thing years ago." So, I said, "Okay." So I paid the fine and I took my nets. And so in any event, that's what the escapement period was for, to let the fish go upriver. And so you take all your nets off Friday morning, and then Saturday around 5 o'clock, you'd go back out and you'd put all your nets back on. And you do that every week. And it's an enormous amount of work, yeah. And so you would use traditional gill nets, and gill nets like if you go way back, the first gill nets were hemp or cotton, and then they migrated to nylon, and in the 50s and 60s to nylon. And then in the 70s, I remember the person where we bought our netting material from, actually were from Tennessee, but a salesman showed up and he said to my father, "I have this new netting material. It's called polypropylene." And we looked at it, and I said, "That'll never work." And so he said, "This is going to be the thing of the future." So we bought some, and so did other fishermen. It was so effective because when you put that net in the water, you can't see it. Unlike nylon net, you put it in the water, the fish can see it. So there are some states that ban polypropylene netting. They don't allow it. So we started to use that, and it worked very effectively. But the point I want to make, the old traditional fishery of gill nets was handed down over years, and that didn't change. Unlike commercial fishing out on the ocean, where there's trawlers and they have all kinds of electronics, and there's a lot of overfishing. In the Hudson, it's very regulated, and you're using traditional gill nets, and that's the only type of fishing that is allowed in the Hudson, gill netting. And so that was handed down over the years. So I hope I explained that well.
It
No?
was so interesting.
Yeah.
You did, definitely.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So,
Did I use up my hour?
well, I mean, if you have any final thoughts, but this is absolutely wonderful. We have my colleague David Bell and his son actually have written this program where I can get a transcript of the conversation pretty quickly. It's very rough. It has to be cleaned up in order to publish. But if somebody, once we post these interviews, if somebody wants to use a keyword search, so if somebody goes to the Piermont Library and types in shad or forsythia or striped bass, they'll find the remarks that you made on those topics. So you'll have access to that as well as a tape, and then we'll also have a kind of a vignette of this, a shorter version. I'm thinking the sturgeon story is probably going to be one of the ones that we'll want to grab, or something about commercial fishing. But yeah, we'll
Tell him wait until he sees the picture of you with the sturgeon and your long hair down to your shoulders.
Oh, yeah, yeah, Lori's, there's a picture that was in Our Town magazine, newspaper, actually, in 1974, of my father and I with the sturgeon, and my father's standing with his knee on the boat, and I'm standing there holding the tail, but I have hair down to my shoulders. So, it's interesting. My father, who was a
Love
police
it.
officer, he had his hair very short. And I said to him, when I was in high school, may I grow my hair long? And he said, yes, you may. He said, but you have to keep it clean. No ponytails and no earrings in this house. I said, okay. So I grew my hair long. And so that's going to be in that picture. And I also want to, mention that my mom was clerk treasurer in the village of Piermont for 27 years. And, when I grew up and I was 18, my mother was clerk in the village, and she was very politically involved. And so she said, you need to register to vote. And so I came home one day, and she had the voter registration there, and she had checked off the box of Democrat. And I said, don't I have a choice, whether I want to be Democrat, Republican, or independent? And she said, oh, you have a choice. She said, you'll be a Democrat. She said, my job depends on Democrats being in office. If you don't want to be a Democrat, you can move out. And she wasn't kidding. So all four of my brothers and sisters, we have all registered as Democrat. And, God bless Mom. And yeah, but she instilled the community, and, it was important to her that we give back to the community in every way. And I'll really make a good, very, very personal point. In 54, when they bought the house in Piermont, my father was working on one of the outboard motors in the basement using ether, and there was a really bad explosion in the house. He was burnt over 50% of his body. He spent 6 months in Nyack Hospital, and he was tended to by Dr. McGuffey. I don't know if you know her. Dr. McGuffey is a renowned burn doctor. She's passed on. But my father spent 6 months in the hospital, and the community rallied. They had movie nights. My mother didn't pay for groceries for a year, and they rallied. And that's what we did in Piermont. And we still do that today for people. And so there was a real community feel back then, and everyone looked out for one another. And I that's what I want people to know about Piermont. Behind me, that little fish is a little wooden carving replica of a striped bass, which right now the shad and the striped bass are running up the river. When the forsythia bloom, and the forsythia is almost out of bloom now, and now the dogwood is starting to bloom, and so actually the shad are starting to trail off, and because the shad run is only about 3 weeks long, and so that's when the dogwood starts blooming, it's a sign that the shad are gone upriver, and the run is almost over. So yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your connection to Bell Kelly.
Sure. When I was young, 12, 14 years old, I used to deliver newspapers, both the Journal News and the Bergen Record. And Bell and Tom Kelly, when they lived in the station during the summer months, she wanted the Bergen Record delivered to her. And that's how I met Bell and Tom. And it's interesting because I didn't know it at the time, but I thought Tom was her husband. I didn't realize that Tom was her son. I did find out later on. And so, I delivered the papers there, and I was always fascinated with the train station. And very often when I'd stop by for collection at the end of the week, Bell would be sitting downstairs outside. and we'd have a chat. And later on, she invited me. She said, "Would you like to come up for tea?" And I said, "Sure." And so I would go up in the kitchen, and I remember she would make tea, but she'd make 2 cups of tea with 1 tea bag. And I never forgot that. And she used to tell stories, and she was just a really, really wonderful woman. And she talked about her and her husband, who were the train station or train masters. I'm not sure exactly what you call them. But and she told me a story one time when her husband stopped a train wreck from happening right on that rail line. And so it was pretty nice to talk with Belle. And then occasionally she would make chicken soup, and I'd go up and have chicken soup. And one day, Tom, he said, "We don't live here during the winter." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." And he said, "But, sometimes these young kids here in Piermont break in." And he says, "And I have something for them." And so he comes out of his bedroom with a silver bone-handled revolver. And Belle, she said, "Tom, put that away." I was mesmerized by this. And he said, "I just want to show you, this is what I have for them if they try to break in to the train station." And so, my eyes were wide open. And he was a bit of a cranky guy, Tom. Belle was really, really nice. And so I spent, I'm going to say at least a dozen times I went upstairs and had tea or chicken soup. And that's how I got to know her. And so it was really wonderful. And she knew my grandfather, my father's father, Millard Hardy, who worked in the paper factory. So she knew some of my family, and it was really nice to be able to connect with her. And then one day, she said, "I want you to have something," and she gave me a little telegraph, one of the little telegraphs that she had used when she was station master. And one of the interesting, and so I still have that to this day. And her son, Tom, also one day, he took a Polaroid picture of Belle and myself sitting at the kitchen table. And so I blew it up to 8.5 by 11. And I donated, I loaned the telegraph and the picture to the train station. I didn't donate it to them, actually, because Rich Esnard said, "No, loan it to them. Don't donate it to them." And I said, "Okay, I'll loan it." I sent them a letter. And I remember Belle telling me, and still hard to understand, but she said when different station masters telegraphed, you could tell right away who it was. Now, the telegraph, it's like Morse code, but she said you could tell right away who it was from the different train stations by the way they, communicated. And I thought that was very interesting, that she could identify people by the way they, did the telegraph. So I remember that story. And so she was really a wonderful lady. And I had a really, really nice interaction. And she was part of the history of Piermont. And, then she passed away, and Tom, took over the train station. And after he passed away, the former, village justice, Tom Saganic, for many years paid the real estate taxes on the train station. And then I suspect that he thought at some point that he would take over that property. And I know a number of people in the village, including Audie Moran, were instrumental in seeing to it that the village ended up taking over the property. And and I'm really glad that that has happened, because it really is a part of Piermont's history, and the Historical Society, who's done a wonderful job, restoring it. It's now a museum that's available to the public. And, I was there not long ago with Rich Esnard, and, we were upstairs, and it just brings back a lot of fond memories of when I was there with Belle Kelly many, many years earlier. The one thing that hasn't changed in the train station, have you been there, Bill, in the train station? Okay. Well, the stairs leading from the ground floor are probably the steepest set of stairs I've ever encountered. And she was an older lady, Belle. And so I didn't know how she navigated them, but you got to be really careful. And it's a cute, sort of comfortable little living space. It's not large at all. It's actually 2 rooms plus a bathroom upstairs. And it has an old claw's foot tub upstairs. So, yeah, I know Audie was instrumental, and I know former Mayor Trainer, in seeing to it that the village acquired the property. And so we did, and we're really fortunate that the train station is there and will be there for many, many years, for people to enjoy. And so that was my interaction with Belle and Tom.
When I get a chance to visit it, I'll think about chicken soup and pearl handled revolvers.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's interesting. Last night I had dinner with Lola and Rich, Lori and I, and I told her that I was doing the Zoom tonight with you. And I said, you wouldn't believe, I said, in the last session, I completely forgot to talk about Belle Kelly. And she says, oh no, how could you forget that? And I said, don't worry, we're going to cover it tomorrow night. And so I'm glad that we did. Yeah, going back, back when I was young, one of the other things that was really notable in Piermont, every year in the old Robert Gere parking lot, which is right now where the Piermont Library is now, and Pirelli Park, the fire department used to hold its annual carnival, 4th of July carnival and fireworks. And it was really something. They cooked all the food, sausage and peppers, and, they had little gambling stations. We had the rides, the Ferris wheel and other rides. And then, of course, on the 4th of July, we had fireworks. And during that time every year, Piermont, especially the night of the 4th of July fireworks, I mean, there were cars parked up on 9W. That's how crowded it would get. And it was just really, really wonderful, good, clean fun, having the carnival. And so when I was mayor, we still had the carnival. And so one of the things the fire department had was a dunk tank, where, you would throw a ball, and if you hit the target, the person in the tank would go in the water. Well, they asked me if I was mayor, when I was mayor, if I would volunteer one evening to sit in this dunk tank. And I have to tell you, the line was 100 deep, people wanting to get there and hit the target and have me fall in the water. And I'm telling you, I probably fell in the water 25, 30 times. And they said, can you come back tomorrow night? I said, no. I said, that was enough for me. So that was kind of funny. And, I would say when they would line up, I would say, are you Republican or Democrat? Because, I'm a big Democrat. And we got a big laugh at it. Back then, you could laugh at those sort of things. People, we all got along in the village, politics aside. When you had your elections in the village, it got pretty heated. But in the end, all members of the board worked together for the betterment of the village. And, you had your differences, but you moved on. And it's not so polarizing like it is today. But I know that's not what we're here to talk about, the political scene today. But it was a lot better back then, and I really enjoyed my terms when I was mayor, you know.
Okay, so go ahead. So tell me about the house that Tom and Bonnie live in.
So yeah, the house that they live in is the old Quackenbush mansion up on Piermont Place. And my father, because my grandmother and grandfather lived right next to it, and my father said when he was young, he would get water from the well for a nickel a pail and bring it up into the house. And before Tom and Bonnie bought the house, Don Blauhut owned it, and I used to be sort of like a handyman and gardener for many, many years. And I told Don, I said, I really love this house. When you sell it, call me. I'd really like to buy it. And so one day he did. He called me, but I was too young. I was in my early 20s or late 20s. And anyway, Tom and Bonnie bought the house. And I was a tenant downstairs in the studio. I lived there. And Tom, you know, said, "Oh, I'd like to meet with you and talk with you." And we did. And he said, "Well, how much rent do you pay a month?" I said, "Well, I pay $66 a week." And that's what I was paying. And he said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "You know what, just stay as long as you want." And eventually I moved out. But the interesting story I wanted to tell is that 3 weeks into owning the house, I'm at work, and you have to understand, my sister was the first female police officer in the village of Piermont. She was on the force. And I was at work in Northvale, and one of my machinist friends, I was a machinist back then, he came over to me, said, "Dennis, I'm listening to WRKL, and there's been a shooting in Piermont, and they said a female police officer was shot." Well, I went white, and I left work, immediately came to Piermont, and there were hundreds. I mean, I'd never seen so many cop cars, helicopters. What happened was, next door to Tom's house, there was a family, and a transit officer from New York City came up there with his wife, and he shot her in the driveway, and she died, and he took off, and I remember the police asking me. They said, "You know, you live in the downstairs apartment. He took off and he fled, and he's in the woods." And they had, you know, dogs. I've never seen so many police officers. And they said, "You can't stay in the house tonight. You have to stay somewhere else, because he might try to come down under the basement into your little apartment." And I said, "That's fine. I won't stay there." And Tom and Bonnie were beside themselves. They moved up to this bucolic Piermont, and then there was this shooting, and someone was killed in the driveway right next to them. And I was on the diving crew of the Piermont Fire Department, and I remember Timmy O'Shea was the police chief at the time, not Mike O'Shea. Mike O'Shea was recently chief. This is his uncle, years ago. So Timmy said, "Dennis, I'd like you and the divers. There's a pond behind the house. It's called Witten Pond. And we think the shooter committed suicide, and he's in the pond. And so could you dive with the divers and possibly retrieve?" And so we did. And we were surrounded by police officers. They had machine guns, and we're diving. Martha Bryan, former Mayor Mimi Bryan's daughter, and I, we were dive partners, and we did a grid search of the pond. It was only like 3-4 feet deep, and we didn't find anything. But then 3 days later, in Spark Hill, a good friend of mine, he's actually he's my attorney, Joey Archer. He was a police officer. His family lives in Piermont, and he saw the guy walking in Spark Hill, and he arrested him. He was subsequently tried and convicted and serving in prison. And but it was a wild story. And yeah, so I'm sure Tom will bring that up. But the house is just a wonderful house that they have, and it has a copper roof. I remember painting the copper roof, and it has a lot of history. And Tom and Bonnie have been, Pyrmonist for many years, and so I'm sure they'll have many wonderful stories to tell.
He said it was bittersweet when I called and asked him to participate because I think they might be leaving the house.
Really, I know. I think Bonnie did move her business. She had a business for many, many years in Piermont, and yeah, I mean, be sad to see them go. But people go through transitional periods in their life, and I'm gonna stay here myself. So but anyway, it should be a really nice interview. They're a great couple. So
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. That's a great story. So
Yeah.
so I will keep you posted on the names that you've